Prior to the 1967 Six-Day War, Sinai had belonged to Egypt and the Golan Heights had belonged to Syria. The ultimate goal of the 1973 Yom Kippur War was the recovery of both. Sadat was not looking for a total military victory, but he needed the military narrative to change as a way of altering the diplomatic landscape. The hallmark of the Arab-Israeli conflict so far had been marked with total Israeli military domination at every turn. As a result, Israel was absolutely unwilling to negotiate with her neighbors, and why would she? War is a failure of diplomacy, and if you know that you can win the war, why bother with the diplomacy? The total Egyptian objective was to retake the Suez Canal, establish secured bridgeheads 15 kilometers into the Sinai, and repel a serious counterattack, and that's exactly what they did. The Israeli Air Force was being mitigated by Soviet air defense systems on the Egyptian side of the canal, so 15 kilometers was as far as they could push before leaving the protective umbrella. And from Sadat's side, it absolutely worked. It just required a lot of patience. On October 6th, the fighting had commenced on two fronts, with Egypt coming across the canal and Syria pushing into the Golan Heights. After the first 3 days, Syrian forces had been pushed back to their original lines, and the Egyptian advance had halted about 15 kilometers into the Sinai. Israel then launched a 4-day counteroffensive against Syria, and within a week, Israeli artillery was within range of Damascus. Israel halted their advance, fearing Soviet intervention. By October 17th, Israel had begun pulling troops away from the Syrian conflict in order to reinforce the Sinai. On the Sinai front, concentrated airstrikes and commando raids had slowly eaten away at the Egyptian air defenses, and the combined air and ground war was slowly pushing Egyptian forces back. Rather than pushing against the entire Egyptian line, an eventual Israeli spearhead, covered by a diversionary attack, was able to infiltrate a parachute brigade across the river, which was able to capture a couple bridge crossings, bringing Israeli tanks to the far side. When Egyptian forces still in the Sinai tried a pincer maneuver to cut the spear, it failed, with one side of the pincer being completely annihilated. Ariel Sharon's armored columns began punching a significant hole in the Egyptian anti-aircraft batteries, establishing a bridgehead into the Egyptian mainland. With this open corridor across the canal, Israeli armor began concentrating on the Egyptian side, preparing for a breakout towards Cairo. Israeli hunter-killer teams still spread through the desert, decommissioning Egyptian SAM sites. The Israeli armor eventually successfully broke out to the south, cutting the bridges behind a portion of the Egyptian army still in Sinai, leaving them totally surrounded. Israeli forces had reached the port of Suez by the time the US-Soviet ceasefire actually went into effect. Even though Israel was able to push Arab forces back to their pre-October 6 borders, the Arab successes and Israeli failures absolutely shocked the Israeli people and inspired the Egyptian people in particular. The ultimate result of this particular conflict was bringing both sides to the negotiating table. On October 5th, 1973, Israel had been secure in the idea that they could always take anything they wanted by force, and Egypt had felt they'd been embarrassed repeatedly on an international stage. This war effectively erased both of those sentiments. So here's where we end up once everybody's officially stopped shooting at each other. On this map, white is the territory Israel held prior to the Six-Day War. The light blue is the territory Israel held after the Six-Day War. That's where we were when the Yom Kippur War started. At the end of the Yom Kippur War, the white and light blue remains unchanged, but we see these green areas where Israel is indisputably holding foreign territory, and these red areas where Egypt is still holding parts of the Sinai. By January the following year, an armistice had been hammered out, returning full control of both sides of the canal to Egypt, with a UN-administrated buffer zone between Egyptian and Israeli-held Sinai, and in 1975, the UN buffer became Egyptian territory, with the buffer moving farther to the east. Egypt also began allowing Israeli non-military ships to pass through the canal, and the United States was allowed to start reinstalling early warning systems in the area. In 1979, the Egypt-Israel Peace Treaty saw Israel retreating even farther, until 1982, when our current international border was finally drawn. The signatories of the peace treaty, Egyptian President Anwar Sadat and Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin, shared the Nobel Peace Prize in 1978, and in 1981, Egyptian President Anwar Sadat paid for the peace treaty with his life when he was assassinated by Khaled al-Islambouli, who explicitly stated that the signing of this treaty was his main motivation. I've covered the assassination in detail over here.